what if you get to the end of your life and you look back at everything you invested in and realize it has no value? But what if you got to the end of your life and you realize everything you invested in has eternal value? In 1949, a college student by the name of Jim Elliot wrote in his journal, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." It would be like a full 7 years before the world realized how important those words were. He was a student at Wheaton College at the time, had the world in front of him. Like, he was a world-class level athlete. He was very smart, handsome, he could do whatever he wanted to do. He felt like God was calling him into the mission field. While he was at Wheaton College, he met his future wife, Elizabeth. They just fell in love. They were smitten with one another. And Jim told Elizabeth, he's like, "I can't marry you yet because I first have to go out into the mission field to make sure I am clear on what God's call in my life is before we get married." Because he didn't want to drag her into some weird adventure, but he also was prioritizing his relationship and commitment to the king and the kingdom. This is kind of who Jim was. Everything was on the table. So Jim goes into missions work in Ecuador. He begins to reach people and had a great missions going on, just like transforming lives and communities. He and Elizabeth finally get married, and they're doing missions work in Ecuador together. And by any measure, you would look at the missions he was doing and say, this is successful. And you could do this for the rest of your career and it'd be a successful career. But there was something inside of Jim that wasn't sitting right. There was an untouched people group deep in the jungle, the Harani people. And they were a violent people. Like, anyone who tried to make contact with them had been killed. Other tribes were afraid of them because they were murderous. When they had tensions and conflict within themselves, they would just end it with a spear. 60% of the population of the Harani people died by violence of their own hands. This is how they functioned. They were untouched. Anthropologists said that they were an unreached people group. The country of Ecuador had written them off and forgotten about them. Missionaries said, leave them alone, just leave them in God's hands and go focus on people that you can reach. But Jim was like, but these people are made in the image of God. These people Jesus died for. They need to know the gospel of Jesus. And he says, what if I'm the person? So he recruited 4 of his friends. And 4 of his friends come down to Ecuador to help him. They're all married. They all have kids. In fact, Jim himself had a little girl named Valerie. And they go into this dangerous environment. But they had a strategy. They weren't just haphazard about it. They had an airplane, and they would fly over the Harani village, and they would drop resources, like baskets of resources for them and gifts for them to begin to warm them up. And one day they land their plane on this sandbar on the river, and they called it Palm Beach, and they set up camp. And a few people from the Harani tribe came out and connected with it, and they made a connection. For the first time in history, there was a positive connection that was made with the outside world. So they get on the radio, and they're radioing back to their wives and their families back at base camp, and they're like, there's success. We've made contact. We're building a relationship, and there's so much excitement, and they're all thrilled, they're celebrating, and then radio silence. In January of 1956, after 2 months radio silence, the search plane went out. As they're flying over the river, they get to the area of Palm Beach, and they see the yellow airplane sitting on the sandbar, and it is kind of torn apart, which is not a good sign. As the plane began to circle lower and lower, they finally saw what they were afraid of. 5 bodies floating in the river of the jungle. 5 missionaries who lost their lives at the hands of the very people that they went to reach. Now, the missionaries were armed, but they chose not to use the weapons because they believed that the Harani people needed Jesus more than they needed their lives. And the world finds out, and it was in the news, it was all over the place. Missionaries massacred, it said. And the world was asking the same question. Why? Why? Why would you give up your life for that? 9 kids without their dads now. Spouses who no longer have a husband. Lives changed and turned upside down. For what? But remember what Jim wrote. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Jim died at 28 years old. The story gets interesting after that because his wife Elizabeth made a huge decision. She took her daughter Valerie and they moved. They moved in with the Haranis to the village. The people that killed her husband, she moved in with them. And she began to share the gospel of Jesus with them. Could you imagine that level of forgiveness? To go live with the people that murdered your husband? A little girl who's going to grow up looking up to the men who killed her dad? But Elizabeth, one by one, began to reach them for the gospel. And an entire village has come to be followers of Jesus Christ because of what they did. Not only have they become followers of Jesus, but Valerie has been discipled by someone that she calls Grandpa, who murdered her dad. The whole community's been transformed. Elizabeth has sold millions of books as a result of it, but here's the amazing thing. 70 years, there is still impact today because of what Jim Elliot did. Thousands of missionaries have entered into the mission field because of Jim Elliot's story. Something was ignited in the people. Churches have been planted. Missionary organizations have been established. Thousands of people reached, transformed, and changed for the gospel message. Why? Because a 28-year-old gave up his life for the kingdom of God. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep. Comfort, security, his life, to gain what you cannot lose. Salvation, the kingdom of God, the salvation of others, and communities transformed. I think Jim's story shows us that he understood better than most of us what Jesus meant when he said, "Do not store up treasures in this world, but store up treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Store up treasures in heaven that last for eternity." Because what if you get to the end of your life and you look back at everything you invested in and realize it has no value? But what if you got to the end of your life and you realize everything you invested in has eternal value?